Today on Rebuilders, we cover a bit of ground. Mark, what do we talk about?
A lot. We're looking at the culture, we're looking at the news, and we're looking at, is there an alien invasion?
Great question.
Being invaded by aliens. More in particular, we're looking at the Chinese spy balloon, the different crafts that are being shot down. What does this mean for geopolitics? What does this mean for the Cold War? And what does this mean of how that's going to change the culture? Catching up on a lot of news today.
Excellent. Well, let's get into it. If you want to know a little bit more about the episode, a bit of behind the scenes, you can subscribe to our mailing list by heading to rebuilders.co. Let's get into it. Hi, welcome to Rebuilders. My name is Liddy and I'm here with Mark and Daniel. How are you both going this week?
I'm really well, thank you. Doing well over this side. I feel like I'm further away from you guys today.
Yeah.
You are. We have a new constellation of the room. Constellation.
Yeah, constellation isn't quite right. I mean, I guess to a certain extent it makes sense.
So for those watching on YouTube, you'll be able to see the new wall behind us.
Well, it's not, the wall itself isn't new.
Yes. Well, constellation may not be the right word for what I just said, but I think it's the right word for what we're going to be talking about today because I'm excited.
Yeah, well,
because we're in the midst of an alien invasion, and I've been prepared for this my whole life from when I was a boy and saw E.T. I've been ready.
You've been ready.
Is that why you've been building the bunker in your backyard?
Yes.
No, it's so he's got a place to put his baked beans.
Yes.
He bought them in bulk from SPC.
Baked beans.
Really?
No.
Really?
Don't like them.
Baked beans on toast?
No, not having them.
Have you had any artisan type baked beans, with like ham hock and,
they're all right.
Okay. So you just
I've cooked that myself, like proper baked beans. But like, the ones in a can, Heinz, SPC, like.
They're a staple. They're part of.
I don't know. There's a time and a place for me. Good buttery toast and some baked beans.
No.
Okay.
I used to like growing up in regional South Australia, we used to have like fellowship after church on Sundays where there's like a pooled lunch. And one of the regular dishes was like a big pot of baked beans with like caramelized onion through it and whatnot.
So would they take the canned baked beans and put caramelized?
Yep, then caramelized onion.
This is the Barossa. Isn't this meant to be a food region?
Yeah, it is.
Do they chuck some wine in there as well just to...
No, that was communion.
Oh, okay. Yeah, fair enough.
Good Lutherans.
We also had carrot jelly. That was a thing.
Carrot jelly?
What?
Yeah.
What's
on earth?
It was like grated carrot in jelly.
Oh, that was so 80s, putting everything in like jelly molds.
Yeah. Oh, what a rich
That is a Google rabbit hole that
childhood I had.
You can't unsee.
Anyway.
Wow.
Okay, I'm disturbed now.
Well, to continue with feeling disturbed, are we being invaded by aliens? That is the question. Last week we did the episode Discipling the Contemporary Self, and we just want to say thank you to those of you who have reached out and, I guess felt that it resonated with where you're at, where your church or organisation is at, and it sort of, seemed to have touched a nerve, I suppose, of what is happening at the moment. So we're actually going to continue with some of those ideas in our next episode. But today, because it is pertinent, we are going to be looking at a number of things that are happening in the world, in particular Chinese spy balloons, your potential thoughts around the escalation of the Ukraine war, Mark, and what this might mean for changes in culture that could be on the horizon.
Yeah. So, so Discipling the Contemporary Self next week we're going to do part two.
Part two.
But just thought there was some, as this, classically long-term listeners of this podcast know, we interpret what's going on in the world and the culture and then dive into issues like discipleship. So back into the culture and the world this week. But I just thought it'd be of note, quite a fascinating week, really, which needs some, I think, deciphering because, I was looking at Twitter before and it's been a buzz with people asking, are aliens, buzzing the United States? So just to give people some background, basically a balloon was filmed. And I think it was first.
Can I just clarify?
Yes.
When I first heard this, I naively was like, like a little helium balloon just drifting off in the atmosphere. Not the case, right?
This thing was a monster. So
60 meters.
60 meters. What's that in feet for our North Americans?
It is 196 feet.
196 feet. And I think that was at the payload, because the actual payload at the bottom was like equivalent of 3 buses, I think.
It says 60 meters tall.
So outrageous.
Huge. And I think it first came to a note of someone recorded on TikTok or something, and then there was sort of this bit of a public backlash. Not backlash. Well, it sort of turned into a backlash. People were like, why are we letting this thing fly over our country? And is this an invasion of our sovereignty? And because it's a big, I mean, the funny thing is we've got satellites. You know, if you go and stand outside for any period of time at night, you'll see satellites. And there's spy satellites from all different countries going over us all the time with very good cameras. But I think there's something symbolic about a big fat old spy balloon that you can see with your naked eye in the day going over. So this sort of turned into a bit of a political basket. And then Joe Biden gave the order to shoot it down. So they shot it down. I think they'd use an F-22. Is that correct? I'll just get you to fact check as I'm going off the top of my head here, which I think is one of the newer fighters, which can go quite high. So I think it was around maybe 60 to 90,000 feet.
60,000.
So 60,000 feet.
Yeah.
So they had to wait, and because they had such a big payload, they didn't want to do it over you wouldn't want to be sitting in your house in the afternoon and have 3 bus loads of payload dropped on you. So I think they did it just as it hit the water, and they've been retrieving it. So what the news is that has been effectively confirmed as a Chinese spy balloon.
Okay.
China denied it and basically said it was a civilian aircraft that had just
It's like
lost.
a weather thing.
Weather balloon is something. It's like Gilligan's ship, been lost on a 3-hour tour.
A 3-hour tour.
But what's interesting then, you had the news that there was another, there was other ones being seen. So there was one seen going across South America, across Colombia, and others that then you had these other crafts, which basically, I think you had the first one over Alaska, which was a smaller one, and that was shot down by an F-22. I think there was another one in Canada, the Canadian. So basically they've got NORAD, which is sort of this organization or agreement between the US and Canada over air defense. So I think the Canadians alerted NORAD, and I think they gave permission for an F-22 to fly into Canadian airspace over the Yukon, and that was also shot down. They've been yet to be able to find that one.
Okay.
I'm just trying to get the details, Daniel, if you could just fact check me if the one that was over the Yukon is the one that's crashed into. So I think from memory there was one in Alaska, Yukon, and then one over Lake Huron.
You're saying names there I have not heard of.
Okay, so Alaska.
Yeah, I've heard of Alaska.
Alaska, there was the Yukon, which is in Canada. And then I think there was one sort of just almost near the Canadian-US border near Michigan. Is that near Lake Michigan? I don't know. So I'll keep going as you fact check me. But what was interesting about these things is that the Pentagon basically came out and said, look, we're not calling them balloons, they're craft, and added some interesting commentary around it. Or things like one of the reports came back from one of the pilots that as they approached this thing, that their sensors were messed with. The pilots said they didn't know how they were flying, staying in the air. They couldn't see any sort of instruments on the outside.
Okay.
And so basically the news went out that, these 3 objects had been shot down. And at the same time this was happening, China then said they had an object over one of its naval bases where it keeps its aircraft carrier. The Uruguayan Air Force then we're talking about this stuff over Uruguay. So you had this moment where it was, War of the Worlds sort of emerging on Twitter. But really interestingly, you get this weird messaging in the briefings coming out of the US government. So Pentagon, I watched the press conference, and like the journalist said, they're being laughed at that I'm watching a Pentagon press briefing.
Was there anything else on TV at the time?
In no way surprised about this.
There was many. It was during the Super Bowl. I don't follow American football.
Pentagon.
So basically, the reporter asked, I think she asked, the general who's giving the press briefing, can you categorically rule out this is extraterrestrials? And his response was strange in that, like he said, I'm not ruling anything out. And then, of course, the headlines everywhere are Pentagon not ruling out extraterrestrials. And then they've come out and denied it. But then you get this just different messaging. So
hold on. Can I just clarify? You were saying that they identified it as a Chinese
the first
spy balloon. Yeah, and then that was denied. But
No. So they've agreed that they've said the first one, the big
60-meter one.
big 60-meter one was a Chinese spy balloon. But the three others, they're refusing to confirm that they were balloons.
Gotcha.
They're calling them objects or crafts.
Yes.
They're refusing to say where they're from. They're saying they don't know where they're from. They're saying they don't know how they're flying. They're behaving in strange ways that they're not sort of seen. And they're doing strange things. And so they're now currently, I think the Royal Canadian Mounties Police are trying to get it in the Yukon, find it. And they're trying to find the one in Alaska and the one in the lake. So they're trying to find them all.
So what do you make of that, kind of hesitant response?
Yes. Okay. So this is where,
And is it fear-mongering?
Okay, so the reason this is not just like a UFO little chat we're having. I think that this marks something significant, and I'll just spoiler alert: this ain't aliens. So number one,
would you say that the truth is out there?
The truth is out there, and I want to believe. If you come into my office, I got a poster.
Be careful what you say.
So we need to go back a little bit here. And you need to go back to around 2017. You started having these reports come out of basically craft that various, predominantly Navy, US Navy, were encountering. Some of their ships, carriers, the USS Nimitz and the USS Theodore Roosevelt were encountering. And basically a number of footage was released, some of it going back to 2004. And it was with interactions with craft very similar to this.
Okay.
Now, instead of calling them UFOs, they call them UAP, which I think is unidentified aerial platforms. And they were craft moving in strange ways. One of the most famous of these was one that was then classified as Tic Tac. And Tic Tac was a craft which looked like a Tic Tac. Mm-hmm. And it moved, it even went into the water. Now, really interesting, and this has not been mentioned much in the media, but people have pointed this out, that the description of the Tic Tac, which was encountered, I think, off the Californian coast during a naval exercise somewhere off, I think, San Diego, by, I think it was an F-18 fighter pilot or something, that effectively Tic Tac, the description of Tic Tac matches what was shot down over Alaska.
Right.
These reports were released, and it was just very interesting that these were released to the public, and the Navy was saying really strange things like, we don't know what these things are, we don't know how they're moving. It was a very strange release, which at the time I thought I took note of. So often on this podcast you get the fruit of things I've watched for some time. Okay, so
what year did you say that was? Sorry, 2004.
So I think the videos went back to as far as 2004, but I think they started releasing them in 2019, and they were sort of leaked. Okay, so this is how it sort of came out.
Got it.
And there was even a fighter pilot. In 2017, the New York Times reported on some of these incidents, and there was even like a couple of fighter pilots have come out and said, I had this experience. There was also other ones in 2019 where other videos came out of like US ships. So I think it was the USS Russell, which was like swarmed by all these different crafts at the same time. And so really interesting sort of phenomenon. And for the military to say this. Now, look, there's a long history of crafts and stuff like this. But a couple of things to note. These were primarily around military. So often hear, UFOs of, a couple driving home from Sunday night dinner on a lonely road somewhere in middle America and encounter a UFO. These were ones that were encountered around military bases. So that's a note. Okay, so this is where the story intersects with the history of the band Blink-182, which is what I'm sure the audience was.
I mean, we all knew that was where we were going.
So in 2014, the member of Blink-182, Tom DeLonge, I think that's how you pronounce his name, basically announced a new venture that he was a part of called To the Stars for the Academy of Sciences or whatever it was called. And effectively what this was, he talked about he had this interest in UFOs and space, and basically created an entertainment company. I'm just going to read you their mission statement. To the Stars is an award-winning, vertically integrated, I'm going to love this language, vertically integrated entertainment company that creates original content informed by experiences working with prestigious government agencies and academic institutions told across film, television, publishing and merchandise with the goal of turning the world on to new ideas and new possibilities. So, I mean, just magical, absolutely magical.
Yeah.
And the new ideas and possibilities are effectively that there is aliens and there's UFOs and stuff like this. Okay, so it's fronted by Tom DeLonge, and they have been pushing a lot of this UFO stuff. So, talk of aliens and space travel and stuff like this. So it's interesting that this happens just a couple of years before. So effectively what is this? This is a PR media company to promote an interest in UFOs.
Yeah.
Okay. This happens in 2014. So just a couple of years, and they've got a whole media, wing to do this. They've got relationships with all the big media. If you go into their website, they've literally got, featured in the New York Times, Rolling Stone, CNN, Hollywood Reporter, Washington Post, Politico, Variety. Okay. So this is like a big time PR, hugely funded.
Yeah.
Okay. So what is this? Is this just some power punk pop star, Tom DeLonge, doing his thing? Well, he's the chairman of the board. God bless his knitted beanie. But what's interesting is when you start looking at the other people, so I'm just going to read a couple of them. So here you go, UFOs. Who else is on the board? Well, we've got Jim Sevivan. What did he do? He's the co-founder and he's the vice president of operations. What was his job before he did this?
Before To the Stars?
Was he in a punk band? No, he was 25 years the operations officer, which is the big cheese who does ops for the Central Intelligence Agency's Directorate of Operations. And he currently serves as a consultant to the CIA on tradecraft and countering weapons of mass destructions. And he's an award-winning CIA officer. So you've got him. You look at who's on the board of this. You've got Hal Puthoff, who is an advisor to the Department of Defense, NASA, and the intelligence community, and has a long history in the really weird edge of when the CIA was trying to get psychics to do stuff. If you've ever seen the movie, which was based on a book by John Ronson, The Men Who Stare at Goats, there were these really weird things where they were trying to do weird stuff. Just some other people. John Sherman, who's this guy? He's on the board. He works at PricewaterhouseCoopers, the big accountancy firm, but also works for the White Sands NASA missile testing facility. And the Johnson Space Center, NASA guy. So again, military-industrial complex. We've got a Dr. Paul Rapp. Doctor. Yep, he's a doctor. That's good. That's something different. Oh, hang on. He's the CIA doctor. Works for them. And then you've got Dr. Norman Kahn, former CIA counter-biological weapons program, 30 years at the Central Intelligence Agency, and he's an assistant to the US government's NEC, which is the National Security Consultant. So you've got this bizarre group of basically national security people, CIA people who are funding a thing to explore, does the government know about UFOs and how can we sell the public on this? But they all work in missiles and armaments and technology. Very strange. Okay, so hold on to your hats, by the way, everyone here, if you think I'm about to
I've taken mine off because I'm just
it's long gone.
I'll lose it.
So interestingly too, the other person which has really been pushing, another group which has been pushing this and has been the face of this and trying to get leaks out of the government is…
when you say this, are you referring to the suggestion
UAPs.
of… Yep.
Yes. So there's people filing freedom of information. What does the government know about UAPs? Sure. And particularly at the time when the videos started coming out of the USS Nimitz and all of this, you started to have this big we need to know the truth. And there were these UFO guys. They're big on Twitter. They've got YouTube channels and stuff like this. And one guy who was always in the media who works for To the Stars, so the company I just mentioned, is a guy called Luis Elizondo. And he was he is on the History Channel, unidentified inside America's UFO investigation. So presents himself as an outsider, UFO researcher, et cetera, et cetera. So who is he? Well, his dad was a Cuban exile to the USA and was part of the group of CIA exiles who did tried to overthrow the Cuban government in the Bay of Pigs invasion. So that's his father. But what was Luis Elizondo's role before he got into UFO investigation? He was a US Army counterintelligence special agent and he worked for the DIA. He worked for the Office of Defense Intelligence. So he was basically a counterintelligence officer for the US military, and he was military intelligence. So you've got this totally bizarre thing going on where you've got these people going, well, the government leaks stuff and tell us what it's want, and they literally work for the government.
Yeah, okay.
Okay,
so the people who are asking for the information also work for the place that has the information.
Yes, and all tend to be in the field of intelligence and military and technology and et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so totally bizarre, not often seen, but all you got to do is just got to get onto their website and read their bios and stuff like that to get what's going on here. So what am I saying here? Am I saying that the government is hiding UFOs and aliens and they're all working to cover this up and let's all bust into Area 51? No. What I am saying is I think this points to the real story that's going on here, which others have mentioned. So essentially, if you sort of scratch beneath the surface, really what I think has happened is you're looking at foreign technology, most likely. And a lot of people actually think that at some point what you've got is that war has changed and drones have become a huge factor in war, which we're seeing in the Ukraine war.
Yeah.
And you're also seeing mutations of balloons and drones. And balloons can pick up a lot of information and they go quite slow, so they're not always picked up on radar. And it sounds like you had drones basically buzzing, probably from a foreign government. The governments that have been named are probably China and Russia, with China being the main suspect. So you have, this is why I think you've got the military intelligence technological thing. And I wonder whether there is actually a little bit of disinformation going on here because China probably has made some significant technological leap that the US hasn't worked out yet around a new kind of drone which does things, or the American public, for them to hear that actually China is just sending drones into American airspace and buzzing stuff. The other thing that to note is that there's been multiple reports of like US power stations and nuclear plants being buzzed by drones. So effectively what's happening is warfare is becoming drone warfare, which is the first stage of robotic warfare, which is interesting. And I think probably what's happened is you've got the Chinese spy balloons come across. This stuff's been happening everywhere. The reason the Chinese said, well, we've got one too, is probably them saying, yeah, you're doing it to us. So they're both doing it to each other. Everyone's probably doing it to everyone, to be honest. And the public sees it on social media. It creates a bit of a storm.
Yeah.
So then there's a change where the government basically says, well, we're going to need to do something about this, and they start shooting them down. That's of note because it took a long time to get here. But I think what this means is one of the big things defining our grey zone moment is I think the warming Cold War between the US and China.
Yes. Yeah.
And I see this as an escalation of that.
The shooting down of
the shooting down. Because obviously they knew each other, were spying on each other. That's what happens in a Cold War. John le Carre, the famous former British intelligence officer, and wrote all the Smiley series of books, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. Those books, one of his books was called The Looking Glass War. So he said a Cold War is where you look at each other. But what you've actually got now is you've got US pilots firing Sidewinder missiles at unmanned craft. But this is an intensification. Now, the British government just announced that it's changed basically how it assesses balloons and craft coming over its country. And so it looks like they'll start shooting them down too. So this stuff starts to spread. Will Australia look at this? So there's balloons being going all around the world. But it's just one of those things where you just see things just accelerating a little bit. I do have another point to make on why this perhaps may be happening at this moment and how this relates to the Ukraine war, but I'll just stop for questions from my fellow hosts.
So one question I have, being a 30-something-year-old, I only caught the very tail end of the Cold War, US-Russia, and obviously wasn't particularly aware as a toddler of the global tensions that were occurring. But how does this, iteration of a Cold War compare to that? And would you say that there's still that collective anxiety. Like, I guess when I look at the news, I don't check in with it as much as you do. But I do sense, there is a significant global tension. But would you say that it's different? How are we as people on the ground every day in a relatively untouched area? Relatively. How are we coping with it and how are we responding? Is it different?
I think that's a great. So the world as we understand it has been shaped by the Cold War and then the lack of a Cold War.
Yeah. Okay.
So post World War II, that whole era was deeply shaped by an ideological battle between communism and capitalism.
Yes.
And Western liberal democracy and sort of Leninist, Stalinist, or Leninist states, Marxist, Leninist states. So there was huge amounts of things done in the West to ensure that there is not a communist subversive element.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people talk about woke culture in inverted commas or critical theory, and in many ways, part of the reason that happened was you had this new kind of post-Marxism is because intelligence agencies and people controlling institutions. There was a lot of work done in sponsoring left voices that weren't talking about economics because they feared subversion. So they would get them to talk about, feminism. I think I've mentioned here on before, like Gloria Steinem, who's a famous feminist, was like basically a CIA asset, and that was multiple people, So you had this shaping of culture, the other, nuclear war, this great value in the West of, like freedom and democracy versus, sort of government control and so on. And then the world was shaped by, oh my goodness, it all went away very quickly, And I think for me, my age group, it ending was really what was amazing. And then, the world, we're going to head towards this utopian thing. And you went from the world splitting from two great blocks into integration.
Yeah.
So you had the bringing of China into the world economy, and the idea was if we can all just connect enough, we're not going to go to war or we're not going to have struggle.
Yeah.
Russia was brought into the global economy, and so I think everyone thought that's the way we're going. We couldn't go back, but I think we in a sense are heading into another Cold War. We're in Russia is in a land war with Ukraine, which is being supplied by increasing amounts of Western, so you could argue there's a proxy war between NATO and NATO was set up to fight communism, like back in the day,
yeah, true.
or be a protection against the Soviet Union. So I think we're, and this is the reason I'm bringing this up. I think one of the biggest things shaping our culture was the Cold War, the lack of a Cold War, and so the cultural mood and the culture is gonna change if we're re-entering into a Cold War 2.0.
Yeah.
You are seeing, even in the last year, there was an interesting article called, I think it's called "Is Woke Winding Down?" And it talked about the Biden administration and how there was an element like when Trump was in, you had a lot of sort of, protest movements and so on. We talked about this, the difference between governing and in a sense, protesting. And this article was arguing that now you've seen it's almost, and I've heard this article didn't say this, but almost other people saying it's less between left and right now as it is between the center of the Western institutions. And I think the Ukraine war has made this. So it's like, let's defend the Western institutions versus these disruptive voices on the edges. And you'll see now them pushing back as much as the hard left and the hard right. And even the hard left and the hard right are sounding the same. So I think that we're moving to a time where that thing of let's tear everything down, there's power over, let's cancel everything. I think it is going to start to wind down. It's still around, but it's super mainstream now. But I think it's in sort of the main institutions of the West interest to, in a sense, guard their institutions. Because if you're going to head into a Cold War or potentially a future hot war with a foreign competitor like China and Russia, a foreign competitor like China or an alliance of China, Russia and Iran, and you've got people in your own culture where you've encouraged this question authority, question power, you're in trouble. So I think you're seeing the screw slowly being turned back a little bit where, instead of pulling down the institutions, there's this language now, we've got to celebrate our institutions of freedom and democracy. Look what Russia's doing in Ukraine. I think this is going to change things.
Yeah.
And I think it's just the start of this we're seeing, but this is going to have tremendous change.
Yeah, and I like it's interesting, if we think back of all the conversations that we've had about the grey zone kind of moment that we're in, and the notion of power shifting from, institutions to becoming fragmented and power moving all the time. I wonder how difficult or how that's going to change the nature of a Cold War if power dynamics are so fluid.
Yes.
I think that will be fascinating.
And it's almost like, so maybe this you've just sparked a possible answer to your original question is the first Cold War was very two centralized industrial, institutional economies trying to outdo each other. And Ronald Reagan always deliberately tried to get the Soviets to outspend themselves, and you could argue that Soviet Union exhausted itself because institutions fell. This is much more networked. So we're now talking about things like, people are trying to break the dominance of the US dollar, and China's trying to create a new network where Russia's trading its oil in yuan, or, like Chinese currency is being used by India. So they want to create their own other network. And even this brings everyone into play. So even, look in Latin America, they're I think it was Lula, the Brazilian president, the new Brazilian president, and Alberto Fernandez, I think in Argentina were like, we're not going to send aid or arms to Ukraine. Everywhere is in play now. Even in the South Pacific, like places like Solomon Islands and Fiji are in play in this new global Cold War. But it's about who controls the network.
Yes.
And so even things like chip technologies, quantum computing, and interestingly too, even so from what I've read of the balloons and the drones, they're actually creating networks of surveillance. So this is how they work. They're bouncing stuff with each other. So it's like literally what we're really at here is what we talked about a long time ago is China's trying to build a surveillance network over the US, and US has already got one over China. So it's not all one way. So I think it's more who controls the global network. And you look at Chinese initiatives like Belt and Road, they're trying to beat America because America controlled. I talk about this in Non-Anxious Presence. Since World War II, America has controlled the global network.
Yes.
China, and it's bringing allies like Russia and Iran, are trying to now create their own network in opposition. And this is going to change culture dramatically.
But I think what's also really interesting is the first Cold War, if we're saying that this is the second one, it was a lot easier for national identity was much clearer.
Yes.
And so, you think about all of the media that was produced that was coming out of Hollywood in particular during that period of time. It was very easy to create a narrative and construct the other, the enemy. And, often they were Eastern Bloc representative figures, in like Die Hard's an example of that, even though I've not seen the film. But it'll
we should do a whole episode on Die Hard, seriously. Near
I need
Christmas.
to watch it.
It's a whole thing.
But I wonder, in 50 years' time, going back to look at the media that's produced, the narratives that are being told and retold, what's typical of them and how are nations trying to establish national identities, or are they? Or is it more networks establishing identities and you somehow connect to that network rather than it being about national borders? Or
yes.
Anyway, I've just a question.
No, this it's a great question because I don't know if I mentioned this last week, but in Melbourne, it was 2 weeks ago, there was basically a sort of massive brawl at Flinders Street Station between supporters of the BJP in India, the Hindu Nationalist Party, and supporters of an independent Sikh state. And most people in Melbourne don't even know this happened, and there was video of it. It was like hundreds of people in the street fighting. And that's how there's an issue happening in India, which is about nationalism. Yet because you've got an Indian diaspora around the world connected through the internet, you can have a battle in Melbourne, Australia about something that's about, in the Punjab region in India. So I think you're right. But then how do then these big forces bring all that stuff into play? Because all of this has got tensions. Do you know what I mean? So even in the Solomon Islands, you've got different islands and ethnic or cultural identities in the different islands. Some are aligned to the West and some are aligned to China. So even a small place like that, like the Solomon Islands, this is dividing. So I think just on your comment with movies, I think it's going to be less movies. It's more the internet.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. I guess when I talk about media, I think about the media products that a culture produces, which is less about film now than it is about
totally.
other
I mean,
forms.
it's even interesting. And look, this sort of slightly brings us back. Maybe this will bring us full circle to the UAPs.
Yes.
Sorry, were you going to say something?
No, I wasn't.
So interestingly, and part of my questioning of why this is my question, and I've been wondering why are they being so imprecise with their language around the UAPs when I think it's very obvious they think they're Chinese drones or balloon drones or whatever. Yet they're sort of keeping it open, like, well, we're not going to say they're not aliens. Like, that's going to like get picked up by the media, and every news outlet was like, it could be aliens. There was the sort of big story that broke last week by Seymour Hersh, the Pulitzer Prize winning investigative journalist who broke My Lai, some of the stuff that happened to Abu Ghraib, and, part of the reason the whole church committee happened, which was an investigation into what the US intelligence community was doing around the Carter administration. He broke a story that basically US was the ones who blew up Nord Stream 1 and 2. And just to give you a quick history of that very quickly, as fast as I can, that at the end of the Soviet Union, West Germany reached out to Russia and Soviet Union began to do oil and gas, which is really important for a country to get energy. But it went through Ukraine. Wasn't a problem. When Ukraine went independent, it became a problem because Russia didn't control Ukraine. So a lot of what's been happening in Ukraine is also about the oil and gas that goes through Ukraine to the west.
Yeah.
So you can always turn it off. You know what I mean? Germany and Russia built a new pipeline, and even that story is filled with intrigue, which didn't go through a country, went through the Baltic Sea. And basically what that did is it gave a way for Russia and Germany to be aligned without going through Ukraine.
Yes.
So this served Russia and Germany. Now, the whole time, there's American politicians have been amazingly unified, from people like Ted Cruz to Democrats, both Republicans, but all sides of the Republicans, all sides of the Democrats have overwhelmingly been against Nord Stream 1 and 2, because what it does is it gives Germany energy away from the US, and it gives Russia a hand over Germany, if that makes sense of influence. So when it blew up, the blame was quickly attributed to Russia, even though the fact that it probably hurts Russia more than anyone, and hurts Germany and pushes Germany more towards the US. So Hersh writes this article, basically says, the Americans blew it up. But what was really interesting was hardly any commentary on it in America, in institutions like the Washington Post, which famously investigated Watergate. And I'm not saying Hersh is right, but it's an interesting story that should be pursued. And the New York Times, which, backed him with things like My Lai eventually when he did that massacre. So there is an element that I wonder if and I heard an interview with him. I think he did one interview, and he talked about the fact that it's totally different now, that in a sense there's such a strong rally around the flag moment happening in the media because of Ukraine war and Russia that no one wants to ask these secondary questions. So I wonder if it's now less about movies portraying it as it is, what you see on your Instagram feed or your Twitter feed is more how it'll look now versus, Rambo fighting the Russians in Afghanistan in Rambo 3. 2, 3?
I don't know. I
like
haven't seen any of them.
Oh, sorry. Go on.
Yeah, okay.
So sorry, I linked that to the UAP because part of me was like, is this a distraction? And I don't want to get a conspiracy theory here. I don't like part of like, now everyone's talking about the aliens and not that. Is this a dead cat, as we've used the term
yes,
before?
we have used that term before.
Probably not, but it's just interesting that story has sort of been ignored by lots of people.
Yeah. Well, we've covered a lot. Did you want to mention your thoughts about Ukraine war?
Oh, yeah, just lastly, I think so what I'm saying is we're laying a lot here. I think the sort of warming up of the Cold War and the escalation is going to change things globally. Yeah. And I think the other thing that we're seeing is that, the very sort of hot rumor is that on the 24th, that you could see a significant. They actually be saying on the 24th of February there could be significant escalation as Russia does another significantly large mobilization.
What's the significance of the 24th?
So I think that's the date they're saying. Is that the day when they actually went in?
No, because it was March.
I don't know what the date is, but I'm seeing that date. I'm looking at Daniel. What's Daniel?
I'm looking at Rambo.
Let's look at Rambo. Sorry. Which, by the way, is the end is dedicated to the brave Mujahideen of Afghanistan. So effectively, Rambo 2 at the end is dedicated to Al Qaeda, or what emerged to Al Qaeda, which is just a fantastic.
There you go.
Just
Sorry, I'm happy to fact check something if you.
That's the date I've heard. I can't tell you why. But,
Yep.
there's strong belief that you're seeing a build-up similar to what you saw at the beginning of the war, and that Russia is slowly starting to take some ground because there's a little bit of an impetus back. I think the last few months have been Ukraine's winning, they're routing the Russians, and the Russians have changed command, but now they're sort of pushing back a bit. And I think, again, you look at all of the, at the end of the year, a lot of the economic predictions you saw in all these banks and so on, they're all making that, the economy's going to recover, et cetera, et cetera. What they don't take into factor is these external events. The reason the economy is stuffed at the moment and we're in trouble is because of COVID and the Ukraine war.
Yeah.
No one could predict them. No one at the beginning of 2020 was predicting at JP Morgan that we're going to have a war and a pandemic. So I think that you're going to see a continuation and possibly escalation of the battle in Ukraine, and I hope it is not so, but you could start to see the fighting become more brutal, and you could see this is going to drive also that Cold War dynamic that we're talking about as well. You're seeing an escalation too in terms of, and I'm not saying this is right or wrong, I'm not making any judgment calls on that, but you've gone in a year from people offering material aid to different kinds of weaponry to just started offering Leopard tanks, and the US is going to provide, I think, Abrams battle tanks and the British Challenger tanks. As soon as they're tanks, we're now talking fighter jets. So there's an element where you're going to get to a point where this escalation just keeps going at a rapid rate.
Yeah.
So the overarching thing is escalation is what we're seeing, and that's going to have an effect on culture. And I think, as you said, in the Cold War, it changed, and there's a bit more of a rally. Not so much. I don't think it's going to be as much as a rally around the flag. Rambo with an American flag and Ronald Reagan, as much as it's going to be an advocacy of the West as a positive thing.
Yes. Yeah.
It may even, I think Christopher Mott wrote an article, he called it the woke imperium, about, you could even see some of those sort of woke values being held onto but pushed outward. Like, we're fighting Russia because they don't believe in this stuff. You're already seeing that.
Yeah.
And even Russia portraying itself as sort of a conservative Orthodox Christian nation, and Islam, and even Putin's even talk about protecting Islam, So again, I think we're moving out of a period, and we're moving into a new period. It's grey zone. We're just starting to see it take form, but I think 2023 it's going to continue to change.
I do have one sort of side question that doesn't really cover necessarily anything that we've
Rambo 3
covered. Yes, I've written it and I'd like to pitch it to our listeners. No. Obviously, there have been a number of big events occurring in the last week or so, and I guess we haven't mentioned it, but the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria.
Yes.
I wonder, with all that we've talked about, how does first of all, that is huge.
Yes.
There have been so many people whose lives have been taken, and it's definitely something that we as the church can pray for, and contribute to aid and all of that. But if we zoom out and just take a look at that in the context of all of the other things that are going on in the world, how do those things interplay at all? Like, how might that feed into greater economic decline, etc.
So the Turkey earthquake and Syrian earthquake. Well, first of all, I just talk about Syria. I mean, Syria, we forget, has been in a war for a long time.
Yes.
And as the West's focus on the Ukraine war has also been a neglect of the Syrian war, which has been utterly devastating. So you mentioned there, aid and stuff like that. And I think often, and I feel this, like I'll think give to something when it's in the news, but you can forget something later.
Yes.
And Syria is still a place in desperate need, and a tragic country that we need to continue to pray for. And to have an earthquake on top of this in places, unbelievable. Can't imagine it. Turkey already was in significant trouble before the earthquake. So Recep Erdogan, who's the president of Turkey, essentially has been creating a civilizational state, as we've talked about in here before, around Turkish values and even with designs or reaching out to Turkic communities, which go all the way to Western China. And he is currently experiencing unprecedented inflation because of the Ukraine war. I'd love to get, if you can, how good are you, Daniel, at getting me the Turkish inflation rate? Like insane amount. So there's already significant economic pressure on the Turkish people. And Turkey is becoming more pushing its power forward. So Turkey, with the West and Russia, Turkey throughout its history has fought with Russia, but he's playing a bit of a role where he's almost like playing both sides a little bit at the moment. Now, some of the pipelines, I talked about pipelines as well, some of the alternate pipelines that were built go through Turkey to Western Europe, and particularly for Southern European countries. So Turkey is a very key country when it comes to energy for Western Europe, et cetera, et cetera. Also, you've got Turkey going into, Turkey's got a problem with the Kurdish minority. And we had recently a terrorist attack. I think it was in Istanbul, I think. And so Turkey has designs on going into even places like northern Iraq or into northern Syria. So Turkey is becoming a powerful country. It's a country in tremendous trouble, though. And we've got a Turkish election coming up soon where there is significant dissatisfaction against Recep Erdogan and inflation. We've got a Turkish inflation number.
Yeah, late last year it was up around 85%. It dropped down to 64% compared to the US, which is like 6%.
Yeah, which is unbelievable.
Crazy.
Yeah, you're a Turkish family, and look, we know through history, you look at countries like, I'm not saying this is going to happen to Turkey, but you look at countries like, Germany, which had hyperinflation, Zimbabwe, and, bad things happen. So you got Turkish involved in civil unrest in its own country with its minorities. You've got it involved in, external things. You've got it on the edge of, also it's become a bit of a grain hub, like it's trying to get grain out of Ukraine and, into the rest of the world. And then this earthquake is just unbelievable on top of this. So I think it's going to have an effect. Turkey is another country that we need to keep our eyes on in what's happening in the world. But this is what we're seeing. We're seeing a world which is going from just America as the sole unipolar to a lot of these smaller or these medium powers, and what happens to them has effects on the rest of the world.
Yes.
So Turkey is a country we need to pray for. And just more from a church perspective, also Turkey is a lot of people who have escaped from places like Syria, Christians who have escaped from places like Iran. Turkey's taken a lot of refugees, and so there's a lot of Middle East churches have found refuge, and leaders have found refuge in that place. So praying for them as well in the midst of this, because I think Turkey is a sort of gateway to what God's doing in the Middle East at this point in time.
Whew. Well, we've covered a lot of ground. Thank you for your thoughts and reflections and giving a bit of clarity perhaps to the broader brushstrokes of what's happening, shifting and changing in culture with big world events occurring. We will be back next week with an episode that continues on with discipling the contemporary self, and we look forward to chatting about that. If you have any questions, send us an email, and you can do that by connecting to our subscriber list via rebuilders.co. We'll catch you next time.